Thank you, Anne. I'm going to speak very quickly, and I wanted to just say how wonderful this meeting has been. Jose, what a great talk, and Hans, I thought it was fantastic, and people before. There was too much material for me to give, so I really cut a huge amount out. I'm going to focus in on only one thing, and that is the last year and a half, we've been trying to set up clinical trials in China to test a cell transplant and drug therapy combination in spinal cord injury, what it took, what are the obstacles, and what it means from the viewpoint of the United States. And I use this provocative title, is the cure for spinal cord injury in China? And the answer is, of course, not yet. First, my wife complained awful about this font, so I apologize for the font to begin with. But anyway, basically, it's meant to remind me of certain things to say. But the incidence of spinal cord injury is enormous in China, and it's been increasing. In the 1980s, it was 5.4 cases per million. 1995, it was shown to be somewhere between 6.7 to 13.7 cases per million. And then in an unpublished study in 2005, the incidence has been documented to be 64 cases per million. And this translates to approximately 80,000, more than 80,000 cases per year in China. And for comparison, the incidence in the United States is 35 cases per million. About 10,000. So they have close to 8 times more spinal cord injuries, absolute number, than we do, and they have more than twice per population than we do, and it's a very scary number. The prevalence is not known, but I just made a rough back of the envelope guess as to what it is. I assume that there were 250,000 people with spinal cord injury in China in 1990. And I assume that the incidence went from 6 to 60 over the last 15 years, and that the incidence, the survival was 90%, and then there were 2% annual mortality rates. And given that, I came up with a number like 600,000 people with spinal cord injury. And if you continued this extrapolation, it goes up to about 1 million in the year 2020. So this, I estimate, would be approximately a third of the world population of spinal cord injury. So China has a very significant spinal cord injury problem. And by the way, this is just spinal cord injury. You do it for head injury, you do it for everything else. They have a big problem. It's bigger than anywhere else in the whole world. They need clinical trials more than anybody else. And by the way, they know and understand this. Spinal cord injury care in China is very limited, in part because I will talk a little bit more about it, the medical care system has been transforming very rapidly at a pace that you cannot believe. But in acute care, they do bone decompression, stabilization, like here, but one difference is that they do laminectomies on almost every patient. It's just routine. If they operate on the patient, they do a laminectomy. And very frequently they do a front and anterior fixation. They flip the patient over, do a laminectomy. I mean, they would do both sides, and it's on a routine basis. They do it without second thinking about it. They just do it. They do it so fast, it's unbelievable. The typical spinal surgeon in China operates on 400 cases a year. And they have so much more experience operating, there's no comparison. No U.S. surgeon has anywhere close to the kind of experience that the average spinal neurosurgeon or orthopedic surgeon in China has. Rehabilitation is almost non-existent. There are maybe 4 or 5 centers in all of China that provides rehabilitation, and we're struggling now to bring rehabilitation to our centers. However, in a few centers, they provide state-of-the-art rehabilitation that I think far exceeds anything in the U.S. And we can talk about that at another point. Chronic care is abysmal. There's no mechanism for chronic care. There's nobody to take care of the patients. So I have seen patients who are 4 or 5 years after injury, still with a Foley catheter inside them, having repeated urinary tract infections, and then my telling the patients that if they don't change this, they will die. And then they go through the telephone with doctors in Hong Kong to find out how to do intermittent cath. I mean, this is how bad it can be. Things like neuropathic pain is treated with acupuncture and herbal medicines. It's a veil of tears in terms of chronic care in China, and this is something that needs to be addressed very seriously. Now, when I arrived there in 1999, there were all sorts of rumors of clinical trials of all sorts. I mean, people were saying, well, they're putting in fetal stem cells, doing this and that and that. I wasn't able to find any of it. It was actually very difficult to find. I can say now that I have visited over 100 hospitals myself. I've interviewed the doctors. I've talked to almost everybody involved. And there have been very few actual clinical trials. And the ones I list here are the ones that I've actually encountered. So, in terms of subacute therapies, this hospital in Jingzhou called the Henan People's Provincial Hospital has now done about 220 patients with bone marrow autografts, CD34 plus. Not enough recovery to write home to mom about, and I think they're stopping that trial. There's an incredible study that we're trying now to get published. I'm helping them publish this, and I've analyzed the data. I've examined all the patients, really quite an impressive study. They're doing intramedullary decompression of the patients between 2 to 65 days after injury. They're doing what Reginald Allen did in 1911. You may recall he's a Philadelphia physician who took dogs, contused them, and then afterwards he cut open their spinal cord and washed the necrotic things out, and these dogs were much better. In Kunming, they have done 30 patients. Between 2 to 65 days after injury, all Asia A, complete spinal cord injuries, they would go in, open up the spinal cord, remove all adhesions, and then if they felt that the spinal cord was soft, necrotic underneath, they'll do a lateral myelotomy, which is, I think, the best approach. And they would wash the necrotic material out, and over 50% of the patients recover walking. Really impressive. They also showed that it is safe, but the one thing that they did show was that this kind of exposure of the spinal cord may have significant therapeutic effects, and this really brings up the issue of what should the proper control be in transplantation. In terms of chronic spinal cord injury, the therapy that has achieved the largest number of patients that have been used is olfactory and sheathing glial cells. These are obtained from fetal cells, and I'm just going to tell you a very quick story. I'm going to talk as quickly as I can, but a former postdoctoral fellow of mine who worked with me in 1999 to 2001, isolating rat olfactory and sheathing glial cells from neonatal olfactory bulb, went back to China. He was at that time the head of the Naval Hospital neurosurgery, and this is 2001. He went back, and 9/11 was happening in the U.S. But anyway, on Christmas of 2001, he wrote me an email, and he said, Wise, I just transplanted fetal olfactory and sheathing glial cells into 35 patients with spinal cord injury, and they seem to be recovering. I said, you did what? And he says, look, the method that we use to grow the cells is the same that we use in the neonatal rats. Neonatal rats look like human fetuses, about the same size. The same method works. So the first time I went out there in April of 2002, I examined his patients. By that time, he had already done 160 patients. He, I think, was transplanting these cells into the patients. Up to 171 patients, he was exposing the injury site and just injecting the cells above and below the injury site and doing a wide laminectomy. After the first 171 patients, he went to mini laminectomies right around the injury site and just not even exposing the injury site, but injecting into the surrounding areas. And I confirmed at least two of his observations at that time. Number one, almost all the patients I saw had at least 4 to 8 dermatomes lowering of their sensory level, which was actually quite impressive. And this was occurring within 6 weeks after injury, after the surgery. I think this is a real phenomenon, that the sensory improvement is real. And I've seen enough of the patients to know that it probably is lasting. I've seen several patients that were 2, 3, 4 years after, and they still have that sensory improvement. I think the motor improvement has been extremely modest. Now, he's published this several times in Chinese journals. I must say he's tried many times to publish it in the U.S. journals, and nobody will publish his work. I am a little disappointed in this because I think his presentations have been, although they're not ideal, I think the information is still useful to some extent. One of the things in U.S. journals is that they absolutely refuse to publish things that they think may be a little bit questionable. And I think we need to deal with this because there's a lot of interesting, useful information that are coming out overseas that just are not being shown in the U.S. Okay, he has now done over 700 patients. A lot of people have criticized him for doing so many patients without really doing a controlled trial. And I'll talk about the regulatory environment later because it's actually quite relevant to this. But what a lot of people don't know is that at least 3 other hospitals have replicated his results. One is the Beijing Army General Hospital. They did 30 patients. One is the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hospital in Guangzhou. They've done 64 patients. And then the Xi'an Jiaotong Hospital recently picked this up, and they've done, at least when I was there last year, they had already done 10 patients, and they report almost the same results. Sensory improvement, moderate, modest motor improvement. And these are on unmatched fetal olfactory and sheathing glial cells. By the way, we've now looked at these cells, and what we find is that the way he's growing them is that about 50% of the cells are actually probably astrocytes, GFAP positive, and 50% of the cells are olfactory and sheathing glial cells. The olfactory and sheathing glial cells from human are very different from rats. They are more P75 positive, and we've actually done a study of human olfactory bulb and the olfactory and sheathing glial cells in those cells. And these are just fragments of cells, of tissue that he has left over that he's not using in his tissues. Okay, so let me go on. The Kunming Army General Hospital has done about 180 patients with fetal Schwann cells. By the way, I didn't even know that there was such a thing as fetal Schwann cells. If you had asked me, do fetuses have Schwann cells, I would say I really don't know. Anyway, they would pinch the peripheral nerves from first or second trimester fetuses, and they would dissociate them, grow them on collagen, and the way they transplanted the cells is really, I think, quite interesting. They were doing a lateral myelotomy on the patients and washing the inside of the injury site out, just like in their decompression study. And then they would put Ethicon, catgut suture from Ethicon. You know, this is a biodegradable suture. They would put that into the culture, and the cells will grow on top of the suture. So they would have all these fetal Schwann cell covered sutures. And when they open up the spinal cord from the side, it opens right into the injury site. They would open right between the dorsal root entry zone and the lateral column. It's a beautiful entry. You just go in and you split and you look right into the central part of the spinal cord, and you don't damage any of the dorsal column or lateral column. You have an opening there, they stuff the fibers in, right in the middle, and they then take the whole collagen, fetal Schwann cell coated collagen, and they lift it off. They take the cell side facing the spinal cord, and they put it right on, tuck it in, close the dura, close. They can do this procedure in less than 2 hours. And they did hundreds of these cases. Anyway, I was not convinced that I went there in 2004, and I was not convinced that this treatment was really making all the patients walk. However, I saw 5 or 6 patients that really did walk. I must tell you, very unusual. In my time looking at patients, I have never until that time seen a patient convert from Asia A to D. I've seen lots of patients convert to Asia A to C. You know, for example, Christopher Reeve is an A to C. Not useful movement. So they did an analysis of all the patients that they did these transplants, and it turns out that all of them were done early, within the first 2, 3, 4 weeks after injury. So they were going to publish a paper saying that fetal Schwann cells are beneficial to spinal cord injury when transplanted within the first month or so after injury. I then asked them, I said, how do you know this is not from the surgery? So starting last year, what they did was they did 30 consecutive patients who came in with Asia A, and they did this whole procedure, but they didn't put in the cells. Okay, and that was the study that I'm referring to in terms of the intramedullary decompression study, and that was the study that they found 54% of the patients walking. So this is a very interesting thing. This is just developing. All this data is now pouring out, and it's something to think about. There's one place, very interesting, Tianjin University Hospital, and Naomi, you should be very interested in this because this is Schwann cells. There's this man, Feng Xijing, who had gone and done a PhD thesis down in Adelaide with Rob Rush, and very good place. And he was at Flinders, and at that time he had this idea that he would tie off a sural nerve of a rat. At the same time he injured the spinal cord, and then go back a week later, harvest that distal part of the sural nerve, which was filled with degenerated fibers and probably Schwann cell precursor cells. He minced it up and he transplanted that into the spinal cord, and he saw all these rats get better. He's still in the process of publishing that, but as soon as he got back to China, in Tianjin, he did 10 patients using this method. So he would go in and tie the sural nerve, wait a week, harvest it, and then minced it up and transplant it into the spinal cord. And he claims that the patients are getting better. So he's now trying to replicate this, and this is an interesting therapeutic approach that is actually quite feasible. Okay, many other therapies are quite unusual. I won't spend much time on this, except there's a Zhang Xiaochen in the Shanghai Hospital has done over 4,000 cases bridging peripheral nerve from above the injury site to peripheral nerve below the injury site. Dr. Zhao from Tongji University has now done hundreds of patients where he has transferred from a lumbar route to a ventral route to the bladder, and I've seen the effects of this. It's really truly amazing. He's getting patients with 3-foot urine streams by scratching the dermatome of the lumbar route that he's transferred. Now he's done this not only in China, but he's done about 30 of these patients at NYU. And he's now taught a number of groups in Detroit and Philadelphia to do this procedure. It's a below the injury site transfer of nerves. Now there's one group that I've recently come out very strongly against. This is a group called Baker Biotechnology. They've been transplanting CD34 plus cells into patients, and these are non-HLA matched cells, and they're giving it either intravenously or intrathecally. They're doing as many as 2 patients with spinal cord injury per day, and they're charging them $22,000 to $30,000 per patient, and they're advising them to, if it doesn't work the first time, to do it a second time and a third time. So many of these patients are paying up to $80,000, $90,000, $100,000, and they have just website blogs on how the patients are improving. There's just no science involved, no examination of the patients, and I've been very critical of this group. A lot of problems in China, but the problems are not as great as some people think. And the first is that evidence-based medicine is still being accepted or coming into China for the very first time. The second one is that the doctors are very used to charging patients for experimental therapies. Even though we think it's unethical here, the practice there is that this is usual practice, and patients expect to pay for experimental therapies. The third is that now the regulatory environment is perhaps the strictest in the world, in China. And the fourth one is that there's still not yet a definition of the fields of orthopedic and neurosurgery, so there's a fuzziness in the field, and let me just discuss these in some detail. So, as many of, almost very few people nowadays remember the time before clinical trials. But I went to medical school in the 1970s before there was real clinical trials. And in fact, the NASCA study, the National Acute Spinal Cord Injury Study, was the first randomized spinal cord injury clinical trial, and that occurred in the 1980s. In those days, we were taught we'd there wasn't evidence-based medicine. We were taught the art of medicine. And at that time, we were expected as doctors to give the best therapies possible to a patient and keep giving them until the patient recovers. I mean, that's the way medicine was being carried out. And if you try some experimental therapies, that was okay, because especially if the condition is really desperate, you as the doctor would take experimental therapies and give it to them. And patients oftentimes would pay for this, and doctors oftentimes would charge for this. And this is exactly what happened when the first heart transplants occurred. The first kidney transplants were that way. There weren't formal clinical trials, and the patients paid and the doctors charged. Of course, today, these things would be very hard to do because we would have to have double-blind randomized clinical trials. But in fact, almost all surgical therapies have not gone through rigorous clinical trials in the United States. And so, really, evidence-based therapies came about in the 1970s, and one of the reasons that they came about was a very interesting one that nobody has to date mentioned, and that is clinical trials are the only way you can disprove ineffective therapies. There's no other way. We haven't talked about clinical trials as a means of saying this doesn't work and therefore we don't use it. But this is one of the most important functions of clinical trials. And so, in the United States, there's now the culture of evidence-based medicine where evidence of efficacy is required for treatment approval, clinical trials are being used to rule out ineffective therapies, and safety and rationale only needed for trial approval. So this is something that Naomi mentioned, and I told her I'm so glad she did. In the United States, you don't need efficacy in order to go to clinical trial, to get a therapy approved for clinical trial. Because one of the purposes of clinical trials is to show that it doesn't work. So, a lot of people don't understand that actually China in 2004 imposed the highest standard of clinical trials in the world, much higher than in the US. In 2004, they imposed the highest international good clinical practices standard on all clinical trials in China. This means that all clinical trials must have all the paraphernalia of clinical trials, including IRBs, ethical reviews. There must be a separate room inside every hospital, patient confidentiality, and record-keeping practices. Everything must be according to the GCP guidelines. And they went one further. They require something in China that's not currently required in the U.S. or Europe, and that is they require clinical trial insurance coverage of all patients that undergo clinical trials. And they gave all the centers 2 years to get on board. And then 2007, they started enforcing. So currently, all hospitals are not allowed to do clinical trials unless they're certified both at the hospital level and at the departmental level. And at the departmental level, the head of the department must take an exam and pass it. It's actually very difficult. Many of the heads of our department really didn't pass it and had to take it over again. And so this is at a level is unheard of. Nobody asks the head of neurosurgery at Mass General to take an exam so that they can do a clinical trial, but they are requiring this in China. They also have a couple of other things that people don't know. For example, I talked to Jaren recently, and they were saying, well, what about, can we do a phase 1 trial in China? Immediately I told them that, in 2004, they actually passed a law that says no overseas therapies can be tested in China unless phase 1 trials have been tested already. And that is because in China, they're very concerned that the Chinese people are not used as guinea pigs for unethical treatments overseas. And then finally, in last year, boy, this is, we were talking with the SFDA, the state FDA of China, and all of a sudden the top leadership of all the SFDA disappeared on us. They weren't responding, so we asked for a meeting with them, and just before we went to the meeting, what we were told was the guy's been arrested, and oh, by the way, he's been tried, and they've sentenced him to death. And that when we arrived there, they already shot him in the head with a bullet. I can tell you this put a chill into the bureaucratic environment of China like nobody could imagine. And we have this wonderful woman who's a lady who helps us raise the money. She's head of our fundraising campaign. She's a very traditional Hong Kong woman, Hong Kong Tai, who whenever she goes to a meeting, she always takes out her capacious handbag and brings out these little gifts and tchotchkes for everybody. So she opens up her purse and she started giving to people, and all the people from the SFDA got up and ran from the room because they can't accept gifts. I mean, this is how incredibly tight the situation has become. So every rule, every I is dotted, every T is crossed. There are no exceptions. And they're very, very concerned, and they're extraordinarily cautious about approving anything that might reflect badly on them. Okay, and then finally, there has been, until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't even a residency program in China. So if you want to be an orthopedic surgeon, you just joined an orthopedic department, you operated until they made you a member of the department. Then they call you an orthopedic surgeon. The same thing was true of neurosurgery. And orthopedic surgeons do everything. The peripheral nerve bridging I was talking to you about was all done by orthopedic surgeons. They have no hesitation opening up the spinal cord and injecting cells into the spinal cord. This is not allowed in the US. If we try to do this, we'd be shut down. Orthopedic surgeons in the United States work on only bone, and neurosurgeons touch anything below the dura. Now, it was very interesting how easy it was to get things going in China because orthopedic surgeons could do everything for transplantation. But when we tried to do this in Taiwan, which follows the US standard, we couldn't get anything done. The neurosurgeons basically put their foot down and said, orthopedic department cannot transplant cells, absolutely cannot. And we spent 3 years getting clinical trial agreements signed. I think this problem will be present in the US, and it will be very significant. And it's very interesting, in China, 90% of spinal cord injury cases are taken care of by orthopedic surgeons. Neurosurgeons do not control this field. Okay, standards in China, I'm just going to point out the third thing, which is something that took us by surprise, and that is the military hospitals are our best clinical trial centers. It turns out that they're the first centers to be completely certified, and the order goes out, data is collected, treatments are done, and I can tell you, it's fantastic. The military system in China is very efficient and very good. Insurance. How do patients pay for their treatment? When I first went there in 1999, it was completely government-based. By 2004, actually by 2002, it had converted into this incredible mess. It was a cash-based system. If you didn't have cash, nobody would take care of you. 2004, 10% of the patients had health insurance, and then by 2006, 90% of patients now have clinical trial insurance, health insurance. But the strange thing, or not strange thing, the interesting thing is that it's 50% copay. So there is tremendous consumer pressure to keep the costs down. And typically what happens is that a diagnosis is made, doctor walks in and gives plan A, plan B, plan C. Plan A is cost no problem, best of treatments, all Western medicines, surgery, etc. Plan B is all generic, some surgery and some Chinese medicines. Plan C, the cheapest, is all Chinese medicine, acupuncture, herbal medicines, waving of hands. China actually has a system that has a very effective means of holding costs down because patients can't afford to pay, and they simply will question, do I need that? What is that for? And yes, what are the alternatives? Whereas in the US, we never ask these questions, but in China, it's very strong. We should not forget that there's a huge population of very wealthy in China who's willing to pay cash for everything. There are probably more millionaires than there are population of New York. Okay? These guys pay money, and in fact, one of the interesting developments in China is that used to be $1,000 paid to the department chairman for collecting data was, big thing. Now they don't even glance at $1,000 US. But even more important, we find that many of our surgeons don't even operate in their own hospitals. So I asked why. Well, what happens is that because they're the top surgeons in China, they're always being asked to operate at a private hospital. So they get on an airplane, they fly to a hospital, they get paid $20,000 to provide the best surgery for some wealthy person, and they fly back. And many of the surgeons are making a ton of money, and the motivation for doing clinical trials is actually changing now. And I'll talk about the motivation later. And finally, we should remember there's no such thing as liability or malpractice insurance in China. In China, if you kill somebody or something, it's treated as a criminal homicide. It's not a civil matter. And so I asked that hospitals, what do you do about malpractice? They say, well, we keep a lot of money in a safe here. And when the families complain to the police, they pay the families until the families stop complaining. That was the malpractice insurance. There's some misconceptions. One of the misconceptions is that ethical standards are low. In fact, I don't think this is true. I don't think anything goes in China. And in fact, I think it's now becoming more difficult to get a cell transplant therapy approved in China than in the US. There's also the assumption that quality of care is low. And I agree that there's tremendous variability of quality of care, but there are some centers in China whose care is as good as in the United States. And even more interesting, many surgeons or doctors here in the US will be absolutely astounded by how well equipped the hospitals are. I would say almost every hospital in China now has multiple 3.0 Tesla machines. They're using diffusion tensor analysis routinely when they're doing all their scanning of the spinal cords. They have, recently we held a consensus conference on what is the best way to transplant cells into a spinal cord. I asked the group, how many of you have CT guidance for cell transplantation? Every hand went up. They have taken the huge trade imbalance and they've translated into equipment for their hospitals. And many of their top-of-the-line hospitals look like Hyatt Regencies. They're glass and steel towers. If you go to Shanghai or Beijing or whatever, this is what it looks like. It's really, it's a different world now, just in the last 10 years. And then finally, there's a lot of people who say that Chinese doctors are not as good. In my opinion, Chinese doctors, at least in surgery, are much more experienced than US doctors. And they have experienced everything. They've seen everything, and they typically operate on 10 times more cases than the average US surgeon. They have really almost very, very little complications from laminectomies. They have very few complications from cell transplantation. Okay, so I started this thing called China Spinal Cord Injury Network. Let me tell you very quickly the history behind that. It really began in 1998 when this young Chinese gymnast, Sung Lan, broke her neck in a gymnastic accident in the Goodwill Games. Her parents happened to be from Ningbo, which is where my father comes from. And her parents actually came to my lab before they even visited her in the hospital, and they asked what all parents asked, is there anything that could be done? I became very good friends with her, and in 1998, when she went back to China, we held a dinner for her at the New York Chinatown, and she was crying. And I asked her, why are you crying? And she said, how will the cure come from the US to China? And I said, the only way is to have clinical trials there. And I promised her that I would do my best to make sure clinical trials come to China. So in 1999, I went out there, and the first two professors that I met, I was really impressed with. And one was Professor Zhu Gong at the 4th Military Hospital in Xi'an. The other was Li Jianjun at the China Rehabilitation Research Center. And along with these people, we've now recruited the China SCI Net centers, which I'll show you. We now have 25 centers. These have the top hospitals in China. I've already indicated to you that many of these are the top medical universities, the top military hospitals, but let me just point out at least 3 of the hospitals to you. One is under Beijing. There's a PLA 301 hospital.
There's a pointer. It's in the.
Actually, it's in
wise,
your left
it's
hand.
in. Oh, there's probably.
It's okay. It's okay.
You're holding onto it. That thing's pointer.
Oh,
Okay.
Very top one.
wonderful. So PLA 301, that's People Liberation's Army 301. This is the hospital that took care of Mao Zedong when he was dying. This is the hospital for the top political leaders of China. And it has this innocuous name, 301. But this is the best funded, top doctor hospital in all of China. They are one of our members. The Beijing Army General Hospital is, of course, the top army hospital. This is like the Walter Reed. Fudan University is the #1 medical school in China. It's in Shanghai. And the 4th Military Hospital is the top medical military university in China. Really incredible. By the way, China spent nearly $100 million on spinal cord injury research, and one of their major centers is in the 4th Military. Okay, fairly recently we included the Tzuchi Buddhist Hospitals. This is just very briefly, this is the Tzuchi Foundation, Buddhist Foundation, is the largest catastrophic relief organization in the world. They run 4 hospitals in Taiwan. It's headed by a 72-year-old nun whose name is Master Cheng. And she, about 3 years ago, decided that she was going to invest in stem cell research. And when they decide to do something, they are serious. In my estimate, they've spent over $300 million US on stem cell research alone in their centers in Hualien, in Taipei, Taichung, and Tainan. She's never left Taiwan, never been on a boat, never been in an airplane. She's connected by internet. She's an incredibly smart, sophisticated nun who's worshipped by 5 million people worldwide, and I have been told that they each give $1 a day donation. So they're a serious player in stem cell research. They have a huge facility for cloning, and probably nobody's ever heard of them. And they are going to be, and they shun all publicity. So, and they are part of our network. And I can tell you that this is something that is happening in China that in the US we don't even, or in Taiwan that we don't even know about. Okay. So all the money for the China SCI network actually have come from Hong Kong. We've raised all the money in a whole variety of things, including, the Barcelona soccer team played for us and things like that. A lot of things have gone on in China. We've raised the money. I made the decision very early on that we would not raise any of the money for China SCI Net in the US. It's all raised in Hong Kong. We're just now starting to raise money from China. And a few donors from the US have given in, but we have not actively tried to raise money for this. By the way, fundraising in Hong Kong is picking up. In China, there is no such thing as fundraising. So we're trying to change this. Okay, I'm going to keep going very quickly. We want to test combination therapies, we're standardizing outcome measures, and we're training investigators. In order to get the Chinese investigators to work together, we actually hold these workshops and symposia. We hold 4 of them per year. When we first got the people together, they told me that they had never, ever been together in the same room at the same time. These are Chinese, the top Chinese surgeons don't work well with each other. They're very competitive, and this is the first time ever that they have joined forces to work together. And it's very interesting. The reason why they tell me they do this is because they now understand the only way they can get rid of all the non-effective therapies in China is to join forces, to test therapies, and if therapies doesn't work, they have the data in which to say, don't use that therapy. They understand that this is a very major problem in China, and they have to do this by collaboration. it gives me really warm feelings inside when I go to one of our meetings. We've been meeting now consistently since 2004, and people are more excited about the China Spinal Cord Injury Network than I can ever imagine them to be. Everybody here knows about clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, so I'm not going to go through them. But from the very beginning, we decided that the therapies that we have to orient our clinical trials towards is combination therapies. And so there are essentially three major problems that have to be solved in regeneration spinal cord. And one is to bridge the injury site, the second one is to provide sustained growth factor support, and the third one is to block growth inhibitors. So we search for possible feasible cell transplants, and the key word is feasible. We look for methods of sustaining growth factor support, and thirdly, we evaluated treatments to block growth inhibitors in the spinal cord, and that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to aim to get these things into therapy, into trial. So everybody has seen lists like this. These are the different potential cell sources. After looking very carefully at all of these, in fact, I interviewed Woo-Suk Wong on two occasions. I've talked to many groups in terms of cell sources. We came and decided to focus our effort on umbilical cord blood. And the reason we did that was as follows. First, a number of independent laboratories have reported beneficial effects of umbilical cord blood transplanted into spinal cord. Now, the first two studies are sort of not credible. One is by Saporta, 2003, and one is by Zhao in China. And basically, they use human UCB cells, and one used a clip-compressed cord, the other used hemisected spinal cords. And I just didn't find these studies all that believable. However, all these three studies were done with the contusion model. They're done by people I trained. And even more important, I think the results really fit with what we have seen in our lab as well. So basically, Ku in Seoul, Korea, found that human UCB cells don't survive in the spinal cord very long. And by the way, none of these used cyclosporin. They only survive for about 3 weeks, and only when you give BDNF along with human UCB cells did one see improved walking, and that if you do either one alone, you don't get improved recovery. And Nishio in Chiba University did CD34 enriched cells, and they found that this improved walking. Dasari published 3 papers. He's from Illinois. They're from Illinois, and they did human UCB cells into contused spinal cords and found improved walking. We were very much influenced by the fact that there are human umbilical cord blood banks that are available that would provide, can provide HLA-matched cells to us, and that this is a long established GMP source of cells. And this is what Hans talked about. GMP was a tremendous concern to us, and we didn't want to spend 5 years developing a GMP source of cells that would be needed. So we decided to go for this particular GMP source of cells. Now, the alternative to this is bone marrow stem cell transplants, either stromal cells. But to do that, we would have had to develop GMP labs in each one of these clinical trial centers, and we could not afford to do that. So this actually was not defined by as much science as much as by feasibility and the presence of some data indicating potential benefit. And then in 2004, my colleagues at Hong Kong University published this paper in Journal of Neurotrauma, which is really very interesting. They found out that chondroitinase and lithium together stimulated regeneration of rat spinal cords, but each one alone did not. So in 2005, this paper was published in November of 2004. 2005, came back to the lab. I said, listen, let's put some lithium onto cells to see what it does. Because I had always thought lithium was just for manic depression. Who knows? Well, to our enormous surprise, what we found was it causes cells to proliferate. And the first cells that we tried it on were rat neonatal blood cells, and it caused the mononuclear cells to proliferate like crazy. By the way, it also causes embryonic stem cells to proliferate. In fact, lithium is part of a standard non-serum-based media. If you look at the contents of that, there's lithium inside the media. And we also found out that particularly in blood cells, and particularly in mononuclear cells from human umbilical cord blood and from rat, we found that it stimulates the cells to produce a huge amount of neurotrophins. We have some unpublished data that now have worked out the mechanism by which this occurs, and I'll just talk about this briefly. It inhibits an enzyme called glycogen synthetase kinase beta 3, and GSK beta 3 normally phosphorylates a nuclear factor called NFAT, nuclear factor of activated T cells, and NFAT, when it's phosphorylated, cannot get into the tissue, into the nucleus. NFAT is the target of calcineurin, which is the enzyme that cyclosporin inhibits. And so when NFAT enters the nucleus, it turns on all these genes for both proliferation as well as neurotrophin production. And we see a 100-fold or greater increase in secretion of several key neurotrophins when we give lithium to human umbilical cord blood cells. One of them is GDNF. Second one is NT3, third one is NGF, and the fourth one is LIF, leukemia inhibiting factor. And these are all factors that have been reported to stimulate regeneration in the spinal cord, so we're very happy to see that. And we thought that lithium would be a very good drug to do an initial study on to see whether or not we can provide sustained growth factor support. So if you remember, the first of the combination was to provide cells, the second one to stimulate growth factor support, and now the third one is the axonal growth inhibitors. As many of you know, there are a number of growth inhibitors have been identified. These include the NOGO family and MAG and other myelin-based proteins. There's CSPG, and there are a number of molecules that play a role during development. What is very nice is that there are drugs that have now been shown to directly block these, some of these. And there are now 2 NOGO-A receptors that are in clinical trial, or soon to be in clinical trial. This is Novartis's drug, anti-NOGO antibody. It's based on the IN-1 of Martin Schwab, and they're now finishing their phase 1/2 trial in Europe. There's a NOGO receptor protein that's made by Biogen, and this is a very, very nice molecule, protein that binds onto NOGO-A very tightly. There's a NOGO66, which is a Strip Matter's original NOGO receptor blocker, and then there's Cethrin, which is a recombinant C3 toxin, which inhibits RhoA. Cethrin has gone through a phase 1 trial, and I think in 30-something patients, has actually positive results, a 1/3 conversion rate from Asia A to Asia C. A company, the original company that made this with Lisa McCarricker now has been bought up by Alcerez. Alcerez used to be Boston Life Sciences, so they're going forward with this thing. I am a little worried because I've heard that Alcerez is running out of money. But nevertheless, it's a very, very good candidate. Biogen has lingual receptor blockers that are very interesting. There's also the possibility of blocking P75 receptors. And finally, there's chondroitinase and a number of CSPG enzymes. So we would very much like to have a clinical trial where we would establish the cell bridge, give sustained growth factor support, and then add the growth inhibitor blockers. And so we've now proposed these clinical trials, and we've started a couple of them now. The first clinical trial that we've done is a 1-year study of 600 patients with acute and chronic spinal cord injury. And this is to show that our centers can actually collect 600 patients and examine them for 1 year, 6 weeks, 6 months, and 1 year. And we want to show that these are the patients that will come back over and over and over again. And this trial has recently been completed. By the way, these are the same patients that we will now randomize into further clinical trials. These are patients with a proven record of coming back, and we will have solid neurological data on them before their trial. The second one is an open-label study to ascertain safety and feasibility of oral lithium in 20 patients. We just finished that in Hong Kong, and it turns out that there were no significant adverse events. And we're now This one is the study that I had suggested to Kunming to take 30 patients and do surgery to expose the spinal cords, because there's a lot of questions about, what is the risk of actually exposing the spinal cord, and they have now carried this out in subacute spinal cord injury, and we're in the process of trying to get this published. We've just started this trial, and we're taking phase 2 lithium trial. There's a double-blind randomized phase 2 trial to assess the efficacy of oral lithium in 40 patients with chronic spinal cord injury. This is being done at the China Rehabilitation Research Center. And then finally, we're in the process of applying to the Chinese government for this study, which is to transplant blood mononuclear cells. And this is a dose response curve. We've now gone through in detail a consensus conference as to how best to inject the cells. We've decided that the best way to inject the cells is at a 45-degree angle into the dorsal root entry zone, above and below the injury site, so we avoid all the white matter tracks. And we are starting out with a 4 microliter injection, and then 8 microliters, and then 16 microliter injection. And these are all with about 100,000 cells per microliter. And then once we have gone through this, 4 patients in each group, this is an accelerated dosing trial paradigm, then we're going to do the 16 microliters injection plus the methylprednisolone. We have now shown that when we give a single bolus dose of methylprednisolone, we increase the survival of cells by nearly 4-fold after an injection. And then after that, if we show that that is safe, we go to the final step, and that is the cell transplantation plus methylprednisolone plus lithium. Okay? And then finally, all this is to aim at a phase 3 trial where we're going to take 400 patients and transplant them with mononuclear cells and then randomize them to lithium or no lithium. Now, people have asked me, why are you planning it this way? Well, I know in China, I don't think I can convince anybody to do a sham surgery control. Nobody will agree to that. So we're doing essentially a trial where we're transplanting cells into 400 patients and randomizing them to lithium. And so what are the possible outcomes? One of the outcomes is that none of the treatments show any benefit compared to pre-treatment. In that case, that's a very strong negative. We would not recommend this therapy for anybody. A negative result is very strong. If we find that the lithium plus cell transplant is better than cell transplant alone, then we can actually propose the use of the cell transplant plus lithium, because that's a randomized trial. If we find that both cell transplants and cell transplant plus lithium is better than pre-injury or pre-treatment, then we cannot rule out the possibility that it might be from surgery. So then at that point, we would need to carry out another clinical trial to determine that the injection would be, that the cells are different. Now, I figured that if we do get that result, and that is both umbilical cord blood cell transplants and umbilical cord blood cell transplants plus lithium are both effective, or both seem to be equally effective, the next trial we would do is we would take another cell type and compare it against umbilical cord blood. Then we would gain some information. We are under severe constraints, I think, in China, and I think this will be true in the US as well, that it will be very difficult to design any placebo placebo group. It would be very hard. Okay. So the hypotheses should be quite clear. CN100 is to determine whether or not the patients can get, the centers can get 1-year follow-up data. 101 is to show that oral lithium is safe. 102 is to show that whether lithium has any effect on neurological recovery. 102B is to determine whether it's safe to transplant cells to the spinal cord, and 103 is to see whether the combination therapy is effective. So, finally, is the cure in China? I think the answer is, of course, no. It's not in China yet. However, they're far ahead of the US in several respects. Number one, the doctors there are much more experienced with cell transplantation than any other country. I think in the US there will be a tremendous hurdle in convincing doctors to expose the spinal cord and transplant into the spinal cord. We already saw this in the Cetherin trial. In the Cetherin trial, even though all the animal data had been actually giving the Cetherin directly into the spinal cord, they chickened out at the last moment and they just put the Cetherin outside of the spinal cord. They put it into a fibrin plate and plastered it on top of the dura. You know, there's only one reason for that kind of decision, and that is they were afraid to open up the spinal cord and open up the dura. I think the same kind of fear will be prevalent in the US. There will be a tremendous amount of arguments about, well, should we open it up, and so on and forth. By the way, we've now had extensive discussions with our group, and the Chinese doctors are so comfortable with transplanting cells into the spinal cord. They consider this to be relatively trivial. And when I said to them, would you rather do a laminectomy, expose the spinal cord, inject the cells under direct visual control, or do you prefer to use CT guidance? Almost everyone said we prefer to do it under direct visual control, because CT guidance, there's a risk that the needle might go right through a vein or some surface vein, blood vessels, and cause a bleed. And so there's a huge difference in experience level, and I think the first clinical trial that will do transplantation into the spinal cord will have a lot of difficulties. Now, there was 2 trials already carried out in the US that has transplanted cells. One is the one in Gainesville, where they put in spinal cord into the cyst, but that was with the excuse of actually operating on the syringomyelitic cyst. But the one trial where they did transplant the cells is the porcine fetal neurostem cell treatment that was at the University of Washington and St. Louis and Albany. So in the U.S., there's going to be, I believe, significant arguments about this issue. I believe that we can carry out in the China Spinal Cord Injury Network clinical trials faster and more efficiently than any other country. We are probably going to finish this particular clinical trial, which I believe in the end will involve about 800 patients. We will have done that for over a period of 3 years and for under $6 million. Now, I'm not, in the 6 million, I'm not including the actual cost of the therapy. So if one counts in that each unit of umbilical cord blood is $22,000, then yes, it's actually twice as much. But actually in terms of clinical trial costs, excluding the cost of the cells themselves, we're, I think, going to be able to show proof of concept that we can carry out phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, a combination therapy for under 6 million. So should we have an American Spinal Cord Injury Network? I believe we should. Now, there have been several attempts now to set it up. The Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation has been funding such a network for some time now, and they're planning to do a trial. The last I heard that they were considering riluzole as in acute spinal cord injury. I want to point out that the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Act has been passed by the House of Representatives and is being considered by the Senate. It was really disheartening. The bill was put on hold by Senator Coburn of Oklahoma, and he has yet to explain why he has put the bill on hold. But next month in April, the 13th, 14th of April, about 300 families with spinal cord injury will be converging on Washington, D.C., eyeball to eyeball with the senators, and really asking them, please put this on the floor and let this be voted upon. I think that there are enough votes to pass this. And what is very nice is that there's been a recent change in the bill. They're now asking for $1 per person in the United States for the bill, so that adds up to about $300 million. So this, I think, actually is going to provide, hopefully, some funding for clinical trials through NIH. And then finally, I've been so embarrassed recently by all these people saying that they're going to travel to China to join in the China Spinal Cord Injury Network. I recently made a decision. We will do a parallel clinical trial in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. I think it's silly for Americans to go travel to China to do this. We need to do it here. It's only a matter of money, and the money's not that big. So we're going to do that. I've made a commitment to doing that, and so we're working on both at the industry, state, and other levels to try to get funding for this and do it. And so, if our goal is to make this happen in 2009. Thanks.